Number one, the shock of your silence. They expected desperation. They were sure you'd collapse the moment they pulled away, because that's how it always went before. You chased, you explained, you gave closure they never deserved. But this time, nothing. No text, no call, no late-night confessions. Only silence, cold, calm, absolute. And that silence, so unfamiliar, so quiet, started to scream inside them. Because the loudest sound is the one you no longer make. They expected fire, but you gave them ice. They prepared for drama, and you delivered peace. Not peace out of love, but peace out of finality. The kind of peace that says, this chapter is over, and I owe you nothing. And in that stillness, they met themselves. Not you, not your love, not your attention, but their own reflection, the manipulation, the games, the pride. Because silence is more than the absence of sound. It is a mirror, and that mirror never lies. It doesn't show what you wanted them to be. It shows what they've always been. Number two, the power of not reacting. This time, there was no reaction, no anger, no pleading, no carefully crafted message hoping to be understood. Just stillness. And in that stillness, something shattered, not in you, in them. Because when someone loses your reaction, they lose their script. And when the script falls apart, so does their sense of control. They used to know exactly how to pull your strings. A word, a silence, a threat to leave, and you'd come running. But now, you say nothing, you give nothing, and in return, they feel everything. Confusion, discomfort, doubt, because the predictable version of you, the one they always counted on, is gone. And what's left is a mystery. You've become silence. And silence, when it's born from self-respect, has a way of showing people exactly who they are. Number three, silence as a mirror. This isn't just absence. It's a mirror. And when they look into it, they don't see you. They see themselves, their ego, their manipulation, their games, all of it reflected back, with no filter, no excuses, no distractions. It's brutal, because that mirror doesn't lie, and it doesn't let them look away. Not anymore. They begin to unravel, not because you yelled, not because you left in flames, but because you didn't. You didn't fight. You didn't explain. You just stopped. And that calm, that stillness, that indifference born from clarity, it becomes the most violent thing they've ever received. Not because it was loud, but because it was final. Number four, the end of the pattern. This is no longer about them. It's about you. It's about the peace you chose, the version of yourself that no longer screams to be heard, the power of disappearing, not to punish, but to protect. Because silence isn't a weapon. It's a shield, a boundary, a final act of self-respect. After giving too much for far too long. And when the pattern ends, when you no longer react, no longer explain, no longer chase, that's when the collapse begins. They expected rage. You gave them peace. They expected chaos. You gave them distance. They expected closure. You gave them stillness. And that stillness, it speaks louder than anything you ever said. Number 5, the script collapses. They waited for a spark, a reaction, one last emotional outburst to confirm you still cared. But nothing came, no message, no question, no invitation to revisit the wreckage, just your absence, unapologetic, unshaken, untouchable. And with that silence, they lost something they never expected, to lose control. Because when someone loses your reaction, they lose the script. The lines no longer land. The stage goes dark. The person they could once provoke with a whisper now doesn't flinch. The one who used to explain everything now says nothing. Suddenly, they're left alone with themselves, their own ego, their own reflection, and no audience to applaud the performance. You've become unpredictable. You've become mystery. You've become silence. And that silence reveals everything they refuse to see. Not about you, but about them. And nothing is more terrifying to a manipulator than the collapse of a pattern they thought they owned. Number 6, the spiritual weight of silence. At first, it's quiet, too quiet. They assume it's just a phase, that soon enough you'll return to your usual rhythm. But then days pass, no texts, no calls, no presence online, stillness. And that stillness doesn't feel like absence anymore. It feels like a presence of its own, a mirror they can't escape. Because silence, real silence, isn't a void. It's a message, one they can't interrupt, debate, or distort. It doesn't scream. It doesn't explain. It simply is. And over time, it settles in, heavy, sacred, unshakable. They start to feel it in the spaces where your voice used to echo, in the notifications that no longer come, in the songs, the photos, the shadows. Your silence begins to haunt them, not out of cruelty, but because it holds truth, a truth they avoided, a truth you once tried to explain, but now you no longer try, because now silence is clarity. It's your boundary. It's your protection. You're not ignoring them. You're preserving you. And that is what they never expected. Not anger, not tears, just stillness. Stillness that transforms. Stillness that speaks louder than any scream ever could. Number 7, the pattern break that destroys them. They were prepared for chaos, ready for a reaction, braced for the storm you always gave them. A long text, an angry call, a final desperate plea for closure. But what came instead was nothing, and that nothing, that's what unraveled them. Because for people who feed off control, your silence is not silence. It's confusion. It's a broken code. The pattern is gone, and with it, their confidence in knowing how to manipulate you. They used to push a button and watch you light up. You'd defend. You'd explain. You'd plead. But now, the button does nothing. No reply, no correction, no proof of life. That's when their ego begins to panic, because what they expected, what they relied on, was predictability. You were the script they knew by heart. But now, the script is blank. And so they spiral, digging through old messages, replaying conversations, trying to pinpoint the moment they lost their grip. But it's already gone, not with a bang, but with a clean, stoic cut. Because this time, you didn't disappear in rage, you disappeared in peace. And that they don't know how to fight. Number 8, the house with a closed door. There was a time when your presence was always open, always accessible. They could walk in and out of your life like it was their right. Messy or not, noisy or not, the door was never locked. But then one day, without anger, without announcement, you simply closed it. And on the other side, they were left with nothing but echoes, not screams, not accusations, just the stillness of a space they no longer had permission to enter. They try to knock. Nothing. They rattle the handle. Still nothing. And then comes the most brutal realization. Maybe there's no way back in. Because that door wasn't shut to punish. It was closed with certainty. To protect your peace. To honor your growth. To create a boundary. And boundaries. To those who had free access for too long, feel like betrayal. But they're not. They're self-respect in physical form. They are the answer to every moment you were taken for granted. This new silence of yours, this closed-door energy, isn't cruel. It's clarity. And once they feel it, they'll never forget how it made them feel. Number 9, the invisible wall of emotional silence. At first, It feels subtle, just silence. No harsh words, no cold replies. Just the space where your voice used to live, now still. But over time, that silence grows into something else. A wall. An invisible wall they can't climb, can't crack, can't even fully understand. They send a message, then another, left unread. No reply. They try to act indifferent, but late at night, they reread every word you ever sent, searching for a clue, a way in. All they find is absence, and that absence becomes unbearable, not because you said something cruel, but because you said nothing at all, because silence isn't always passive. Sometimes it's a mirror, sometimes it's a shield, and sometimes it's the loudest no you'll ever speak. The silence keeps growing. It wraps around their mind like smoke. A song, a scent, an old message. All of it now echoes with what they can't have. And that's what breaks them. Not the fight, not the goodbye, but the void. The sudden disappearance of something they thought was always guaranteed. They scroll, they replay, they obsess. But nothing brings you back because the door is no longer stuck. It's locked by choice, by peace, by a version of you that no longer trades your self-worth for connection. That's when they understand. What they lost wasn't just access to your time, but access to your soul. Number 10. The shift they never saw coming. At first, they thought it was just space, a moment, a break in the pattern. They assumed you'd come back. You always did. A reply, a like, a sign you still cared. But this time, nothing. Not out of revenge, not out of pride, but because you finally understood it's no longer worth it. That unread message on your screen, it stays unread. That old habit of replying instantly, it's gone. Not because you're bitter, but because you've grown. You don't need to prove your worth anymore. You don't chase validation from someone who never offered it freely, and that silence, it's not a pause, it's a decision. The version of you that used to beg, to explain, to fight for attention, died quietly. And what's left is a man who sees himself clearly. You start to disappear, not to punish, but to protect. No more emotional breadcrumbs. No more showing up in places where your presence was only tolerated, never treasured. And they feel it, the change, the confusion, because the pattern has broken. The door they always found open, now locked with no key in sight. They poke, they provoke, they test, but your silence doesn't crack because you've stepped into a new posture, one where your energy is sacred, your peace non-negotiable. This is no longer about being seen. It's about seeing yourself and never trading that clarity for chaos again. They keep trying. A reaction, a crack in the silence, something, anything that signals you're still there. But the handle doesn't turn, the door doesn't budge, and for the first time, they're on the outside looking in. They replay your old conversations, scroll through messages, look for clues, a timestamp, a signal that you might still care. But all they find is emptiness, no response, no echo, just the stillness they never expected. And that silence, it begins to haunt them, not because it screams, but because it doesn't. It forces them to look inward, to confront what they lost, to feel for the first time the absence of someone they thought would never leave. You don't retaliate, you don't explain, you simply vanish into peace, into self-respect, into the man they never believed you'd become. And now they sit alone, not with you, but with the consequences of everything they dismissed. This isn't revenge, this is return to self, to sovereignty, to silence that no longer hides pain, but reveals power. Number 12, the silence that became your identity. At first, it was just a pause, a breath, a space between chaos and calm. But over time, that silence stopped being a strategy. It became something deeper, an identity, a new language, a new self. You no longer speak to provoke a reaction. You no longer show up to prove a point. You've left the arena not because you lost, but because you realized the fight was never worth it. You used to wait for recognition, wait for understanding, wait for someone to finally see you. Now, you've turned your gaze inward. You see yourself. You choose yourself without applause, without permission. And that change, it's permanent. No more explanations. No more chasing clarity from people who never truly listened. You stopped talking, not out of spite, but because there was nothing left to say. You don't miss them. You remember who you are. And that remembering is louder than any scream you could have ever given them. This is the moment you realize you're not on pause. You're not waiting. You're not hiding. You're becoming. And silence, that's just the sound of your rebirth. Number 13, the unreachable you. They thought it was temporary, that you'd return like always, that the silence was just another pause before the cycle restarted. But this time, you didn't pause. You ended. They expected you to flinch, to crack, to eventually break under the weight of the distance, but instead you stood still, calm, certain, and that certainty became a wall, not made of spite, but of self-respect. They tried the usual tricks, the vague texts, the sudden likes, the baited stories. But nothing broke through, because you weren't playing anymore. You weren't waiting. You weren't hoping. The version of you that needed their attention no longer exists. You read the message, you felt the temptation, and then nothing, no reply, not out of pride, but because peace is no longer negotiable. They lost access, and not just to your presence, but to the emotional control they once held. And the worst part, they realize it too late, because you didn't disappear to make a point. You disappeared because you finally understood. You are the point. Number 14, the closed door. They keep trying to open it. The door that once swung open without hesitation. Back then, your world was available to them. Messy, maybe, but open. Now, they twist the handle. They knock. They wait. But nothing happens. Not because you're punishing them, but because you finally locked the door. Quietly, with certainty. And what echoes from the other side isn't anger or noise. It's the absence of access. That used to be your weakness, always being reachable, always letting them in, even when they brought confusion. But now, the entry point is gone, the password revoked, the open invitation withdrawn, and that closed door, not slammed, not barricaded, just gently shut with resolve, drives them mad. Because they don't know how to knock anymore. They don't know how to earn entrance. They never had to. Until now. This isn't revenge. It's clarity. And that clarity has one message. There is no more access to the man you used to be. Number 15. They underestimated you, because they thought your silence was a pause, not a finale. They believed the stillness was temporary, that you'd come back with a storm, like you always did. But what they failed to understand is that this calm wasn't the absence of feeling. It was the arrival of something deeper. Resolve. Not the kind that yells or breaks things, the kind that rebuilds in silence, in solitude, in power. You didn't disappear to wound them. You vanished because staying would have meant bleeding for someone who never noticed you were cut. And what echoes now in their mind isn't your words. It's the hollow space where your voice used to live. No noise, no answer, no presence. And that void, it screams, louder than any fight you ever had. Because now they don't hear you. They hear themselves, their own cruelty, their indifference, their games echoing back with no one left to blame. That's when silence stops being absence. It becomes a mirror, and when they look into it, they no longer see someone who begged. They see someone who rose, someone who no longer needs to explain because he finally knows peace is the highest form of strength. Number 16. At first, it was just silence, but not the kind that fades, the kind that lingers, the kind that weighs. A silence with gravity, with presence, with judgment. They sent a message, then another. You saw it, read it, said nothing, and that nothing spoke volumes. Because it wasn't indifference, it was clarity. It was final. They tried to act unbothered, posted stories, laughed too loudly, pretended they were fine. But at night, in the quiet, they read every word you'd ever written, looking for a clue, a crack, a way back in. But all they found was your absence, an absence that didn't threaten, didn't chase, didn't explain, just existed. And that stillness, it grew, spread like fog, into their mornings, into their thoughts, into the way they listened to songs, and realized they weren't just songs anymore. They were echoes of you. What they once took for granted became the one thing they couldn't reach. You didn't leave a door open, you closed it, gently, quietly, with no warning and no need for one. That's what shook them. Not rage, not revenge, but a peace so real it couldn't be broken. Number 17. This is the turning point most never see coming. The silence has settled. The door is shut. And for once, it's not a tactic. It's a truth. You're no longer trying to prove your worth. You're no longer rehearsing your pain for someone who never stayed to listen. You've stopped asking questions that always came back unanswered. And in that stillness, you found something they never gave you. Peace. It's not that you don't feel anymore. You feel more than ever. But you've learned the difference between being heard and being drained, between being present and being preyed upon. You've become the kind of man who doesn't shout to be understood. You withdraw, you observe, you choose, because true strength isn't in domination. It's in discipline, and your silence, it's not a void, it's a shield. Let them wonder, let them scroll, let them ache in the space they carved with their own hands. Because now, the only voice you listen to is your own. And that voice says, you don't need them to understand. You only need yourself to remember. You never had to burn just to keep someone else warm. So walk on, not in bitterness, but in power. The kind of power that comes from no longer needing closure, because you've already closed the chapter. And the most stoic truth of all, silence was never about them. It was the beginning of everything you've become.